Castlevania Nocturne is here, and to celebrate, I decided to make custom Magic the Gathering cards based on the original Castlevania series. And before I begin, a quick spoiler warning for the entire series. First we have Alucard, Dracula's son, a 4/4 legendary human vampire warrior for 1 white, blue, and a black with flying and lifelink. And at the beginning of each combat, you may have target equipment you control become an XX artifact creature until end of turn, where X is that equipment's mana value. Alucard, of course, is probably one of the most iconic characters in the entire Castlevania series, and the main gimmick of him I decided to build around for his Magic the Gathering card is the floating sword that he uses in combat frequently. In the show, we see him control it from a distance and as a weapon, and I thought the best way to represent this in Magic the Gathering was by allowing you to animate your equipment. With the idea being that the more powerful the equipment, i.e. its mana value, the more powerful its damage should be. If you wanted to use him and build around him, I think he works great in any kind of equipment style deck. So combine it with a bunch of other equipment style synergy pieces like Saram Senior Edificer, Danitha Capuchin Paragon, or Stoneforge Mystic, and he'd go great. Then we have Trevor, the Last Belmont, a 5/5 legendary human warrior for 2 black, red, and a green with reach. And whenever Trevor, the Last Belmont, blocks or becomes blocked by a non-human creature, destroy that creature. And whenever a non-token, non-human creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Trevor. Trevor is of course another one of the protagonists of the Castlevania series, being the last Belmont living at the time of the show. Thanks to his family, he's super experienced in monster hunting, and I wanted to represent that on his card. Notably by making it so he's able to destroy non-human creatures whenever you block or become blocked by them, and whenever you destroy a non-human creature, i.e. a non-human creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on him. The idea being that he's growing from defeating these monsters and becoming a more powerful warrior. Additionally, I also decided to give him reach to reference the Morning Star, which is the most powerful weapon that he uses throughout most of the series. The range on this is absolutely insane, and I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that he'd be able to reach flying targets with it. I think if you wanted to use Belmont, probably the best way to use it is with cards that let you reuse stuff from your graveyard. So being able to pull out creatures that aren't tokens that you can use and get more +1/+1 counters on him would be ideal. So stuff like Chainair Nightmare Adept, Carador the Ghost Chieftain, or Shirei Shizo's Caretaker. I also think he works really good with creatures that are able to kill multiple creatures at once, especially in a format like Commander where you have multiple opponents, so you're able to get triggers off of all 3 of your opponents. So something like Butcher of Malak here, which whenever one of your creatures dies, you're able to hit creatures on every single one of your opponent's board. Fleshbag Rounder does a very similar thing, and then a card like Massacre Girl can be absolutely brutal, because if you play it right, it should be able to wipe the board and leave Trevor left standing and a bunch of creatures dead in its wake. He also of course works great with a +1/+1 counter synergy, so something like Corpse Jack Menace or Hardened Scales to double the amount of counters on him, or using something like the Ozolith so you can move counters from creature to creature. Then we have Sypha, Speaker Magician, a 3/3 legendary human wizard for blue, red, and a white with prowess, and whenever a lord counter is put onto a permanent you control, draw a card. One thing that's very important to note about her character though is that she is initially part of a group called the Speakers, which pass on lore and information to each other all verbally. So I wanted to represent this idea about her specifically with her ability with lore counters, since I think lore counters are definitely the closest thing we have to the stories and knowledge that the Speakers pass down between each other. And also one thing that's very important to note is that she's a very powerful mage in the show, using a lot of elemental and powerful magic, so I thought the best way to represent this in Magic the Gathering would of course be using the prowess ability. If you wanted to build around her, she obviously worked great in any kind of saga deck, so something like the de facto commander for saga decks, Tom Bombadil. She also works great with something like Ondu the Spirit Dancer, which lets you create copies of your sagas and allows you to trigger Sypha multiple times, or you can use Satsuki the Living Lore, which allows you to put lore counters on your sagas and return them to your hand, allowing you to get more triggers off of the lore counter. I think one thing that also works really cool with her is using ways to manipulate lore counters. So something like Goldberry the River Daughter, which lets you move counters around to other non-saga permanents, allowing you to trigger Sypha's ability. Because she doesn't only trigger on your sagas, she triggers on any permanent getting a lore counter. Or use something like Vampire Hexmage to let you remove the counters from your sagas so that they don't go away once they reach the end of their chapters. Next we have our 2 Forge Masters, Hector and Isaac. Both these two are able to use dead bodies in order to create night creatures. However, notably they have two very different approaches to it. For Hector, he's a lot more careful and he's able to use older bodies and is able to make very detailed creations, compared to Isaac, who's only able to use very fresh bodies but is notably a lot quicker in his ability to create them. So that really influenced how I designed both of them. So for Hector, I made Hector Careful Forge Master, a 4/4 legendary human artificer for 2 blue and a black with vigilance, and you can play Demir and tap him to exile target creature card from a graveyard. Then you can create a token copy of the exiled creature card, but you can only activate it as a sorcery. Like I mentioned before, Hector is able to take advantage of bodies that aren't fresh, so I wanted to represent this in Magic the Gathering by allowing you to target cards in graveyard specifically. He is a classic kind of reanimator style build, but with the cost of making you exile your creature cards. So I think if you wanted to build around him, you really need to lean into cards that fill up the yard. So you're going to want to combine him with cards like Fleet Swallower, Maddening Cacophony, or Mesmeric Orb. For Isaac, on the other hand, I took a very different approach, leaning into the fact that he is only really able to access fresh bodies. But I also wanted to make it clear that Isaac is faster in his ability to turn things into night creatures. So rather than for Hector, where we have to pay a cost and tap him, Isaac's happens passively. Specifically, I made Isaac Efficient Forge Master, a 4/4 legendary human artificer for 2 black and a red that has whenever another non-token creature dies, you choose 1. You create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, or you amass 2. What I also wanted to reference is what he does later in the series, where he amasses this massive army of night creatures to fight Carmilla. In the card, I represented this by allowing you to either create an individual 2/2 zombie, or you can amass 2 zombies, allowing you to go wide or tall depending on how the board is looking. Of course, if you wanted to build around him, I think you can use a lot of the cards I mentioned with Trevor, or you're trying to cycle creatures that you already have, or use a bunch of effects that kill a bunch of creatures that opponent controls, so that you're able to trigger Isaac multiple times. Then we have Lenore, Cunning Diplomat, a 3/5 legendary vampire advisor for 2 white and a blue with lifelink, and when Lenore enters the battlefield, you gain control of target creature, and then you can tap her to untap target attacking creature and prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by this creature. Lenore is an interesting character, being a part of Carmilla's council to basically take over Europe. And one thing that we learn about her very quickly is that she's the diplomat. Out of all the members on the council, she is the most opposed to war, and she uses her cunning diplomatic skills to get what she wants. And we see this almost immediately with how she manipulates Hector, tricking him to essentially be put under her control and made it so he's not able to leave or defy her. So to represent this in Magic the Gathering, I made it so when she enters the battlefield, you gain control of the creature. Then also to reference how she's a diplomat and is able to resolve things without any direct conflict, I wanted to make it so she can remove things from combat. The idea that she's kind of like talking somebody out of attacking. And I thought the best way to represent this was with a Maze of Ith style ability, allowing you to tap her to remove something from combat. Then we have Carmilla, Queen of Styria, a 4/4 legendary vampire noble for 2 black and a red. She has lifelink, and when she enters the battlefield, gain control of up to 1 target human creature until end of turn. You untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn, and humans control have tap create a blood token, and humans you control have sacrifice this creature, create a blood token. Carmilla serves as a major villain for the later half of the series, with her main goal being to essentially trap all the humans in Europe and turn them into livestock for the vampires. And I wanted to build her card around the idea that she's essentially achieved this goal. So I wanted to make it so when she enters the battlefield, you gain control of a human. The idea being that you're taking all these humans and kind of locking them away into a kind of like farmer's pen situation. And then also to reference that the humans are being used essentially for their blood and are being treated like livestock, I wanted to make it so all the humans you control have the same ability where you can tap them to create blood. The idea being that you're just drinking blood from them. And then also you can sacrifice them as well. The idea being that initially you kind of treat them like livestock where you're getting use out of them, or if you really needed to in a pinch, you could get a lot of blood really quickly. Carmilla does have an interesting kind of build around where you're having this kind of humans aristocrat tribal deck, so you want to combine her with cards that really benefit off of humans specifically dying. Notably, you also want to make sure that the cards you're running in this deck are able to trigger off of non-token human creatures specifically, so I think if you put her in with cards like Zathra Necromancer, Species Specialist, or Morbid Opportunist, you'd make a pretty great deck with her. If you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one right over here, where I made custom Magic the Gathering cards based on Dark Souls 1.